Hello and welcome to the Keyboard Chronicles, a podcast for keyboard players. Today, I'm your host, Paul Bindig, and I'm excited and pumped to be here with you. And today, I'm particularly excited and pumped to be here because my guest is none other than your regular Keyboard Chronicles host, Mr. David Holloway. So that's right. Today, I'm turning the tables on David. Now, I've got him to agree to this. I've dragged him along, listeners and viewers, kicking and screaming. He is not keen on this at all. But I thought it would be really fun for you all to understand that there is more to Dave than that head behind the mic asking questions. And there is a lot to his musical career, his passion for music, and his passion for the podcast as well. So we're going to spend some time talking to David about that. Now, what you will notice during this interview, which we've already recorded, is that David is a very shy and humble guy. So and I'm being quite genuine. I'm not being ironic, but I'm laughing because he really did not enjoy the process of having the spotlight put on him. But as you will hear, he's got a wonderful story to tell. And the last story I'll tell before we get into the interview is this: how I met David. So this is something we didn't mention or discuss in the interview because of time constraints, but David is the moderator on the Music Player forums, and there's a wonderful keyboard player forum, discussion forum, bulletin board there, and he's been a member of it forever. I've been a member of it for 10 or so years, a dozen years. And we met via that because it's a US-based site and the Aussies tend to stick together and form alliances. And I just knew him by his handle at the time, didn't even really know his name. And I knew he had a Korg Kronos, which I did not. One day I was doing a gig and we backlined a Korg Kronos and I couldn't get the thing to load the samples properly. And anyone who's owned a Kronos knows that there's some nuance and subtlety to getting all the different samples to load. That's why the thing boots for 10 minutes when you turn it on. And I was panicking and I just reached out to David via the chat function on the bulletin board and said, "Hey mate, it's Paul here. I know you're an Aussie. I know you've got a Kronos. Can you help? And he was awesome. He gave me a version of RTFM, which is the keyboard players will know what that means. I won't say it out loud, but he basically screenshotted the relevant pages of the manual for the Kronos to me, which allowed me to get through, and the gig was successful. And I thought, what a good bloke. He did that with no notice and with, any warning. And we've become firm friends ever since. My relationship with David's something I'm really proud to call him one of my best mates. Our bands have played together. We chat all the time. And he's been kind enough to invite me to co-host this podcast with him on numerous occasions. And you wouldn't have seen me here for a while, regular listeners and viewers. It's not because there's been a falling out or a schism. We are not Waters and Gilmore. We are not the members of Cream. We are not Stevie Nicks and Lindsey Buckingham. We are still very much in love. But I've just been so busy with my own musical commitments, and we have a rule which is the guests take priority. So we always try and schedule around them. I'm just a third wheel. But today, I'm in charge. I'm looking forward to this interview so much. We'll see you at the end. Let's go. Oh, David, welcome to the podcast. How are you, sir?
Good. This is all very new. I feel very privileged to be asked on. I've never done a podcast before, and it's all a bit surreal.
Yeah, well, you've never been a podcast guest before. Is that true?
Actually, I have, but I won't bore you with that. Totally outside of music, but a lot of years ago, though. So, yeah.
Right. Well, that might come up in our discussion. So, yeah. What I didn't realise was you were just being your normal cheeky self, saying you've never been on the podcast before. Well, I'm nervous too. Like, I'm legitimately nervous because I've never hosted this podcast entirely by myself before. So, after it's done, David, you can give me a score out of 10 to see how I went. How does that sound?
Yeah, look, I usually start out with about a 6 effort on each podcast, and I think you're already starting at an 8, so I think it'll go well.
Thank you, mate. So let's get serious. Let's start by asking you, David, you've been very busy over the last 12 months. Tell us about what you've been doing musically, podcast-wise. What have you been up to?
Yeah, so, and I love this question. It's a very thoughtful question, Paul. Thank you for asking it. It's one that I like to ask guests too, because it just gives an idea of what's happening most recently before you go delving back into history.
The assessment's already started.
The last 12 months.
We haven't even started yet. You're already assessing me.
No, it was a big tick. So, yeah, the last 12 months has been an interesting one as far as, I'm only in the one band essentially, which I love to bits. The people I play with are amazing, and we're a cover band that plays around the area where I live. We sort of do a dozen to 14 gigs a year, doing 80s and a little bit of 90s, a little bit of 70s, but mostly 80s covers. So that's, been taking up roughly once a month to 6 weeks I've been playing there. I've been running this damn podcast, which has taken up a lot of time, so I'll ignore day job totally, but pretty much this podcast and a bit of a musical project that I'll sort of talk about a bit later when I get time, which isn't a lot of time. So yeah, being busy as always, a bit like your good self.
Yeah, well, for all of our listeners and viewers, we'll definitely go into the behind the scenes aspect of the podcast as well, because I'm really keen for you to understand the work that David does. Whenever I'm on here, which hasn't been a lot lately, whenever I'm on here, I'm always sort of deferring to David and saying, hey, David does so much work and I just get to come along and have fun. And that's really literally true. So we're going to explore a bit of that as we go along. But David, like every other guest, I'm going to subject you the question about your musical background. So like all of us, it doesn't matter whether we're playing in massive arenas or playing on the weekends with our cover band. We all got started somehow. So what drove your initial passion for music when you were a young fella?
Yeah, no, great question again, Paul. Thank you. So it's, I grew up in a small country town of around 6,000 people. So for our non-Australian listeners, I grew up in the state of New South Wales, small country town, had a great upbringing, had very supportive family and so on, which was great. At about the age of, I've actually not been able to think of the time, but let's say age of 9 or 10, the local, what we call a neighborhood center, like a community center, started offering organ lessons. And so some nice person came across from the nearest city about an hour's drive away, and once a week, they must have had some portable Casio, I'm guessing, organs there, and they would teach us the basics. So as far as reading notes, although from memory, the music was some of that music, Paul, where they had the letters for the notes written within the black parts of the notes. So you weren't even having to read the stave as such. And they also had those great cardboard cutouts you put over the keys that also had the letters. So that was how I did that. I'll
do that now.
Yeah,
Are you kidding me? It's fantastic.
I've been tempted a few times, I've got to say. So I feel like my mum and I both went to that for a couple of months. I feel like it only ran for a short period of time. And I seem to recall she came along and took part in the lessons as well. So I think it was a mix of adults and children. Loved it. As far as I recall, I don't recall finding it a grind. And I was lucky enough, family friends sold an organ. It was one of those classic, again, if you're in Australia or overseas, the Yamaha Electone series were everywhere in the late 70s into the early 80s. And so it was one of those ones that had the little drum machine. It actually had a little cassette recorder where you could record your performances or whatever, all the, the basic sounds, two manual organ. And that I just used to spend hours playing on that. That's pretty much my musical upbringing. Did music at school, but there wasn't there was a bit of theory, so I can read. I can't sight read, but I can read music. So I did do a little bit at school, but yeah, basically self-taught by ear player.
So how does that then burgeon into finding bands and finding people to play with? You start the home organ at home and then a little bit at school. What was the next step for you musically?
Yeah, so as a teenager, I was lucky enough that I went to school with my cousin. Sounds like a country town thing. She was actually an amazing piano player, so she did all the grades with the official music exam. She was amazing, and her and I were both keyboard players in this dinky little band that used to play at talent quests. So the first song I think I remember performing was Never Ending Story from Lamar. I can still play that with both hands today in a really rudimentary way. And so we played the odd talent quest or whatever, but the pivotal moment for me was about age 17, so getting towards my most senior years in high school for, again, non-Australian listeners, year 11 for Australian listeners. I had two guys who were in my year that played at a talent quest, and they were absolutely 5 levels above what we were doing. One of them went on to basically work professionally for 24, was still sort of working professionally. They were amazing, and I made it my mission because I knew they were putting together a band to somehow worm my way in there. And by buying a new Yamaha DSR 1000 keyboard, they had already let me in the band, but that was the sealer for getting in the band. And so at age 17, we were playing a gig every couple of weeks for that year and a half. We probably did 50 gigs.
Wow.
Just playing around the local town. And because of the strength of their talent, the drummer and the singer, and we brought in a bass player myself and so on, and a female singer, it went really well. And that was when I got hooked on bands. And then I won't bore with the others, but going into early adulthood, just kept playing in local cover bands. And that sort of just throughout my adult life, when I had the opportunity, just been involved in cover bands.
Yeah, so what happened to your cousin, the excellent piano player? Did you just give her the flick, did you? Did she get kicked out?
Yeah, no. So this is one of the interesting things, and Karen, if you ever hear this, I think I'm representing this right. So she was an incredible player, but didn't have a lot of passion for the instrument. So It wasn't that her parents forced her to do it to some extent. I think there was a bit of coercion, come on, this would be good for you, and so on. But she was never particularly passionate about it. It was something she did as part of her extracurricular activities. And so when she hit adulthood, I don't think she's ever played much ever since. So I know a lot of keyboard players out there probably have similar experiences, that the people that tend to keep that passion into later life, and as you know, a lot of the guests we've had on the show have nearly had that passion beaten out of them by some teachers, and thankfully have found other teachers or found other ways of expressing themselves. That's worked really well for them, and they're still enjoying doing it today. Whereas I think the passion of it was just knocked out of her in her late teenage years. I could be wrong. I haven't seen Karen face to face for a couple of years, but I'm pretty sure she's not playing at all. Yeah.
Well, Karen, if you're listening and that's not correct, drop us a note and we'll correct the record. It's interesting, isn't it? I know myself, I was the same. I did all the classical exams, and I didn't like any of it. By the end of it, became a chore. And it wasn't until my piano teacher realised this, because I finally stumped up the courage to say it, and he showed me some Beatles stuff, and I got into rock and jazz, and that's like, oh, right, this is much more fun.
So how many grades did you do?
I only did up to 5 AMEB. So
yeah, that's enough. So that proves once and for all that you're a better player than me, just purely based on theory alone, let alone feel. Because I think I did some, again, early adulthood, because I don't want to talk too much about day job stuff, but professionally, I'm from a nursing background. And in my early days as a nurse, when I would finish working shifts, I did try and do a couple of other AMEB piano lessons where I was working. And they assessed me initially as being maybe at best a grade 3 level based on my by ear and previous experience. And they just ran me through some scales and stuff like that. But so that proves it, mate. You're definitely
not really though, because I think if I were assessed now, I'd be like grade 0. Because I've lost all my classical chops and all my sight reading chops. So what I've learned to play in rock and that I've completely lost in classical. But anyway, it's not about me, mate. It's about you. So let's keep on moving. So, and I know you said you didn't want to go into too much detail, but my job is to probe deeply. So bad luck. I'm interested in just some of the cover bands that you've played in and how that evolved into the band you play now, which are awesome. That is Gloss. But I'll let you talk about that.
Yeah. So that teenage band had the most awful name. And hopefully none of the guys listen to this, but if they do, I think all but one of them would agree it was an awful name. Actually, I don't think any of the band ourselves named it. It was a hugely valued older friend of ours who ran the local music shop, I think, came up with it. And it was called Slip Rock. So SLIPROCK. I still hate the name to this day. So that was the teenage band. Yeah. Started out with, I'd be fascinated if any of our listeners and viewers have remember these. It was a JVC keyboard. So JVC, who are a consumer electronics band from the 80s, I think they used to make vacuum cleaners and stuff like that. They actually used to make keyboards.
Company, I believe that stands for, David.
Oh, is that what it stands for?
I believe so. Yeah. We had a JVC VHS recorder at home.
There you go. So that was my first keyboard with Slip Rock, and as I mentioned before, I upgraded that to a Yamaha DSR 1000 a few months in, which was met with great excitement. So that was the teenage band. Learnt lots with that. But then I went to university to do nursing and really had to put things on hold for a few years, but then ended up working back in my hometown for a period of time and was with a band called the social cretins. Again, still friends with some of those guys to this day, but I don't know who. I think they were much younger than me. A couple of them were only sort of mid-teenagers, and I was sort of 22 by this stage. One of them obviously didn't know how to spell cretins, so it was Cretons.
Oh, even better.
So social cretons, which I sort of loved. It made it stand out a bit. So that was fun. We played some fun shows. Fast forward many years past kids or whatever, didn't do a lot in music at all as far as cover bands. We'll talk about the other stuff later. But then joined a band called Never, my second most hated name for a band. So again, covers, playing, now living in the Wollongong area. For those outside of Australia, it's about 250,000 people in the metro area and about 500,000 people in the broader regional area around what we call Wollongong and the Illawarra. Played in a band again, and I'll talk about keyboards later. And then what I would call my big break, and I know the guys I currently play with will probably listen to at least part of this. So I had someone recommend to my now great friends Rusty and Tim that who were after a keyboard player for a concept/tribute show called Count DeVille's Rock Circus, which was an amazingly staged show, huge expense, hugely beautifully staged. It had a story behind it, but it wasn't a tribute to one band. It was basically a story about this sort of Satan's envoy living out of Las Vegas, Count DeVille, trying to lure people to the fold by, touring around. It was really, really well fleshed out concept. So I joined Count DeVille, and that was the biggest step up I'd ever done. I had to audition. There was lots of work that went into each show, and that was amazing. And it's with Tim and Rusty and now other people that progressed on to the other two cover bands playing similar music that I'm doing to this day.
Wonderful.
I've never talked so much in my life.
Great. Strap yourself in, David. There's more coming. Trust me. That's excellent. And can I say to all our listeners and viewers, David is going to continue to try and be very humble, but his current band, Gloss, who we have double billed with, are fantastic. They are really brilliant, and David does an amazing job on the keyboards. Don't let him fool you into saying he's not a good player. He's an amazing player and has great sounds, and the band sounds mint. So, and I've met Tim and Rusty, who David speaks of, and they're top blokes. So it's nice, and when you find people. It
is. No, I agree totally. And you raise a good point, though. I do, because I know, again, all of us out there listening will be in a similar boat about the use of technology versus actual playing capability. So, yeah, I'm not being super modest when I say I'm not a great player. I'm not a great two-handed player that can sight read. I can't do really expressive and intensive piano solos and so on, but I know how to cover the really good stuff with, really expansive pads and a lot of what we play in the 80s is a lot of power chords and stuff like that. But I think you raise an interesting point that for a lot of us, the gear actually does make a difference. There are some songs you can have the shittiest gear and you still got to prove you're a good player. Or the best gear, and you've still got to prove you're a good player. But for all that middle stuff, technology can make up for any shortcomings any of us do have as players, which is hugely helpful.
And I would add to that, David, and say maybe it's, yes, you need the technology for a lot of the stuff that we might do in cover bands, but you also need to know how to use it. And you certainly are great at that too. So, again, now stop trying to be humble. I'm not going to allow it. Okay? Give yourself a little bit of credit.
That's right. I'm never going to publish this.
Yeah, that's right. You have ultimate control here, so you can actually do what you like. That's true. Now, I understand, and this is something I didn't know about you, that you have been involved in musicals. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah, look, that sort of goes back to the musical upbringing a bit, but also in adult life. So, and I know this is why one of the highlights of running this podcast is talking to people like Dave Wise. I've talked to a bunch of people that have played in orchestra pits, and so on, is that for those of you that, and I know there are a lot of our viewers and listeners that have played in musicals, it's a whole different skill set in some ways. The actual ability to play the notes and ideally you do need to be a decent sight reader, at least until you've got the the stuff down because you are generally working under a musical director or a conductor. It can be extremely rigid compared to a cover band or other things. But school musicals, I used to sadly be on stage in some of those, and I'm definitely not being self-deprecating when I say I was a rubbish actor. So I actually planned on doing acting as an early adult, and was going to apply to the local, the best drama school in Australia, NIDA, for those Australians who know. Then I was in a musical where, for the very first time, this shows how old I am, they were able to video it. And I watched myself back as a performance, and I went, there is no way you're ever going to NIDA. And I dodged a bullet there. I would never have gotten in, and that's not just me being modest. I had people I acted with that were considered extremely good that didn't have a hope of getting into NIDA either. So I dodged a bullet there, did nursing instead. But as far as musicals go, just developed that love for the pivotal role a band plays in a musical. And so again, as an adult, I had the privilege of being in the pit for Jesus Christ Superstar in my late 20s. And then actually prior to that was when I did Little Shop of Horrors, which is an amazing one for those out there that have ever tried to play that score. It's amazing as well. So yeah, loved every bit. For those, I think I've mentioned in previous episodes, but for those of you that haven't sat in an orchestra pit with a large orchestra, it is one of the most amazing oral experiences you'll ever have. So I'll never forget, particularly with Jesus Christ Superstar, 43-piece orchestra. I was doing the second or third keyboard part that had the responsibility for all the little synthesizer-y bits from the original score. And again, going back to my playing ability, there were a couple of pieces in that I actually had to hand off to the first keyboard player / musical director because I wasn't really up to playing them. And there's another one anyway, I'll talk about that in a minute. So the power of a 43-piece orchestra in full flight. So there are a couple of parts in Jesus Christ Superstar where the whole orchestra is playing, except for the synth player. So there is one song, it's one of the Mary Magdalene songs, I've forgotten the name of it, I apologise, but where the whole orchestra is in full flight, timpanis, the whole thing, and I'm just sitting there doing nothing and watching it. And it's to the day I die, it's one of the best experiences. So I totally get how orchestra pit musicians love what they do, particularly in the older days where you did have 43 pieces. Nowadays, most even professional musicals are either running tracks or running very pared down musical, like orchestra pits. It's not usually like that anymore. Just going back to the playing issue, Jesus Christ Superstar, again, if people know it, there's a song called Everything's All Right where Mary Magdalene's singing to Jesus, who's very stressed out after he's just had a run-in with Judas. To this day, the last 8 bars of the song before that, which is Heaven on Their Minds, the Judas song, I still feel sick in the stomach because the start of Everything's All Right is about it'd be a 4-bar introduction and you're the only person playing. And it involves this, again, decent players, it would not worry them at all. But it basically, you have this jump of, I think it was over an octave from one note to the next. So you had to jump your fingers up well over an octave very, very quickly. We played 15 shows. I got that run right, I think, 3 times. And the other 12 times, every time the conductor would be sitting there looking at me and conducting, and it's just me, and he'd be glaring at me saying, "Let's get it right this time." And it was the most awful thing ever. And of course, he'd be just disgusted when I failed to do the run up properly.
Of course.
Anyway, that's just an anecdote. Yeah. So that's the musical side. I just love it. I do recommend it. Yeah.
That anecdote actually relates to a question I wanted to ask you, which is because I've never had this experience, right, of playing in an orchestra pit. So I'm curious, when you're embedded in with, say, 42 other musicians, and you're playing along with them, do you feel like the pressure's off a little bit because you're sort of in the middle of it all? So if you flub a note or what have you, it's not necessarily going to stand out. And then my other question was, you've kind of already answered. I was going to say, if there's any bits where you're soloing, do you then feel the pressure of all those other musicians listening to you?
Yeah, so you're right. It's a bit of both. So the funny thing with a lot of musicals, particularly those older, well, they're not older school compared to, say, South Pacifics and all that, but those sort of musicals written in the 70s, 80s and 90s, it is a bit of both. You're either comping along, although I've only really had experience with three musicals.
Yeah.
Usually they don't have the piano comping along underneath everything else if it's a larger orchestra because other instruments are covering that. So It tends to be, particularly with synthesizer stuff, a lot of it is soloing or really distinctive parts. But I think there was a little bit of organ where you're essentially doing a bit of chord work underneath. So there wasn't a lot of sitting back and playing and relaxing. There was a lot of sitting back and not playing and relaxing in an orchestra situation. Yeah.
Got it. So last question on the orchestra, mate. What gear did you take in? And I appreciate this was a little while ago, but what gear did you take on for that?
Yeah, so the Jesus Christ Superstar one, sadly, was the late 90s, and I think it was my Roland. I had an A30 controller initially, and I don't think I'd upgraded to the A80 controller by then. So I had a MIDI controller, a Roland one, and a Roland JV 1080 sound module.
Oh, cool.
So that I had MIDI sitting underneath the keyboard and then chose my sounds based on that. That and potentially a Kawaii G Mega module, which someone out there might remember. It was a tiny half rack mount, had brilliant sounds, had all the general MIDI sounds, obviously, but a whole lot more. I think there might have been a G Mega module involved in there somewhere as well. Yeah.
Yeah, nice. So let's and we'll talk more about David's gear a bit later, because David, like many of us listeners and viewers, not me by the way, but like many of us, David loves to have keyboards. He loves to acquire keyboards and keyboard gear, and I can never keep up with what he's got. Every time I talk to him about his keyboards, he's got a new one. And I love this about David. So we are going to talk about all the keyboards he's owned, but that's just a little entree into that. But I actually want to explore technology again. So before I was saying how I think that being able to understand technology and use it is you need both. And we just heard you say, David, that technology really enables. Now, I was mentioning before how you are very good with tech. Well, you are, or certainly were at one point, at the absolute cutting edge of musical tech. And I'm just going to say, tell us about Res Rocket Surfer.
Yeah, look, and I do recommend, if people find this interesting when I talk about this, I think it was episode 100, I did a three-way conversation with Mike Wilcox and Steve Gregory, and we were literally the only three Australians initially that were involved in this project. But to take a step back, so Res Rocket Surfer was an online jamming platform, literally started in 1994. So you can imagine, we're talking dial-up days. We're talking dial-up days pre-56K modem. So we're talking really, really slow. And it was essentially a MIDI client that allowed you to hook up I think it might have been Mac only back then. I'm pretty sure it was. Your Mac to what was called the Dragon client, so DRGN, the Distributed Real-Time Groove Network. And essentially what you did was select your sounds on your MIDI module, and you had a grid where you selected certain phrases that you wanted to play, and then that would upload that MIDI data to the other people involved, and it would play on their MIDI modules. And it was intelligent enough from memory that it understood which sounds were being selected, assuming you were using, I'm not sure whether it was just general MIDI, I can't quite remember, but there was some good MIDI implementation. So in 1994, there were only 25 people in the world doing this. So this was founded by two nerds, and I mean that in a totally positive way, two guys from the USA, Canton Becker and Matt Moller, who were, I think, postgraduate students at a university. I think it was Texas, but don't quote me on that. And they teamed up with two guys from the UK that some of our listeners will actually know. So one of them was Will Henschel, who was the guitar player in an iconic 90s pop act called London Beat. And Will's still going strong today. So I think a lot of people know I've Been Thinking About You as a song from the 90s. Will, played on that, and it might have even been a co-writer from memory. And a guy called Tim Brand, who is an incredibly successful to this day UK record producer, who at that stage had been in a band called Dreadzone, but since has gone on to have a really stellar career in record production. And I'm talking about people that everyone would know that have come out of the UK. He's done some amazing work. The four of them formed Res Rocket Surfer because they could see the potential of musicians jamming online. So there are only about 20, I think, people or 15 people when I was in the local newsagent. So for non-Australian listeners, newsstand, newsagent, wherever you bought your magazines. There was an Australian magazine, I don't know whether you remember it, Paul, from the 90s, called Audio Technology magazine.
Yeah, for sure.
And they had they had an interview with Will Henschel in it where he said, we're looking to expand from the dozen or 15, whatever it was, people to a few more people around the world to really test out this software. If you would like to be involved, email me. Now, again, without sounding too old, well, I am old, most people didn't have email addresses, let alone the capability to email someone. But I had set up an email address about 6 months prior, and our US listeners will get a laugh out of this. My first 12 months on the internet was via CompuServe, which was one of those walled communities that ran out of the US. And I thought that was the internet the first couple of months. I had no concept, but I did have an email address. And then I moved on to sort of having a normal internet, email account. And so I emailed Will out of the blue. And the only reason, and so I had to do an audition, a virtual audition. So I emailed Will from memory. He rang me from London to have a chat on landline. So landline from London to landline in Australia. Had a quick chat. We got on, and then he said, right, I want you to download the Dragon client, log on at this time, and we'll audition you. Now, remembering that this is just a grid and selecting phrases, there was no huge need to be able to play. It wasn't transmitting audio. It was only transmitting MIDI data, and it was phrase MIDI data that you selected from. I passed the audition. So I just fit in well with the jammers, as did Mike and Steve. So Mike was based in Sydney, Steve was based in Brisbane, I was based in the country town I'd grown up in.
Just interrupt here, David. So just for those of us who didn't live this experience, so what are you seeing and hearing when you're doing this audition for you to select these phrases? How does this actually work?
Yeah. No, great question. So because I had my MIDI module hooked up, if someone else around the world had selected a phrase, it was a looped thing. So every 8 bars it would loop around. And if they've added in a phrase from their end, it would start playing on one of the MIDI channels on my MIDI module. So you would actually start to hear this composition coming out with multiple, bass, drums and whatever, albeit MIDI stuff, right? It would start to flesh out as a real song. And I go, well, I really like I now know the bass line is D, F and A. So I'm now going to do a phrase around those chords, and I'd select the grid and do that. And it would work up into a full song. I actually will link in the show notes some links to this because there's some demonstrations of it. At the time, again, for those that were around, the internet was obviously not a big thing in 94, but the media were fascinated by it, and it sort of exploded, not long after 94. And so all the major news networks around the world were interviewing Willie and Tim, not so much us guys, but the owners. They were constantly doing media, which obviously they were keen to do. And it was considered truly cutting edge, and it was great, right? So, but it was ahead of its time. The bandwidth issues made it difficult. I'm not going to go into Res Rocket history, but essentially over that coming 5, 6, 7, 8 years, they merged that into an audio client that ended up being built into a plug-in for, I'm talking now about 1998, into what was then called Logic Audio, Digital Performer, Cubase. I think there might have been a Pro Tools plug-in. Eventually, so that was under Microsoft co-founder with Bill Gates, Paul Allen, funded Res Rocket for a number of years, from about, I'm not exactly sure of the years, but in the lead up to developing the audio client. Eventually, in the early 2000s, they were bought out by Avid Technology, which owns Pro Tools. And I believe to this day that functionality is broadly still built into Avid products. And towards the end, all it was, you'd go into your DAW, dial up a track, obviously, record your bit, and then it would automatically sync with the other people logged in on Pro Tools or whatever it was. It seems really basic now, but back then it was obviously hugely different. There was an album's worth of material recorded, so there was a plan to actually release a Res Rocket album, and this included an actual deal. I won't go into too much detail, but this was a deal with then a very well-known record company. Sadly, that fell through due to arguments over royalties from some people collaborating on that project, which was really sad. And it wasn't the founders. I mean, the founders would have set the rate, but what we ended up with, it's a farcical argument now to what artists earn off Spotify. So even though the royalties may not have been great, they're probably 5,000 times better than what they are now.
Yeah, yeah.
So the album was never released, which is an enormous shame. I have a copy. I can't disseminate because it's not my copyright, but the album was stunning. You know, I had the privilege, I think, of contributing to 3 of the 10 songs on it.
Great.
But it became a professional company. The .com bust definitely had a big impact on Res Rocket. And I don't know that it directly caused its closure, but Avid bought it out, and that was the end. I had the privilege of going to London and San Francisco and meeting the guys face to face. It was just, it was an amazing time, and also got to work with some amazing people jamming. And in those earlier days, more when the audio client rather than MIDI client, so sort of 97, 98, we would be demoing to some amazing artists. Sometimes we'd know who they are. So they'd literally go into a studio in San Francisco or London where the founders were. And so, for example, I do recall Stevie Wonder and B.B. King as 2 people that we demoed to. I'd get up at like 3 o'clock in the morning because that would be the time zone difference. And, there'd be 20 of us jamming. I may not have even contributed much of a part, but as a group, we would demo how the software worked to these amazing artists who were, and Stevie Wonder, as our listeners know, is always really interested in new technology and new innovation. So I'm pretty sure, unless I'm confabulating, but I'm pretty sure Stevie Wonder was one of the ones they definitely demoed to. B.B. King rings a big bell. I remember when I was in London meeting them, Will was ducking off to demo it to Trevor Horn, and I was part of the demo to Trevor Horn. So, it was an amazing time. Sadly, it was before its time and never became the behemoth it probably deserved to be, but it was good fun. I was even employed by them when prior to the .com bust, I was employed as a facilitator to help people learn how to use the software once it was integrated with Logic Audio and Cubase.
Yeah, so, wow. Incredible.
Fun times. So, but I do recommend episode 100. We definitely talk about a lot of the history of Res Rocket, and Steve Gregory in particular is a killer player, and he played sax and keyboards, and he's still doing some amazing production work to this day. And Mike is also, I know, Paul, you and Mike have met in other guises. Yeah, Mike is still doing amazing audio production work and he was working for a major radio station at the time, and still does amazing stuff. And just to show how incestuous all it is, Mike is the guy from midnightmastering.com that I give a shout out to at the end of every show because he's a sponsor of the show.
Sponsor of our show. Yeah, and a great man. Thank you, David, for that little bit of history. I think it's fascinating for us with a more modern context, maybe also some of our younger listeners and viewers, because I was reflecting on your Res Rocket surfer career when COVID hit and everyone was trying to work out how can we jam with each other online because we're not allowed to leave our houses and that sort of thing. So it just shows you that this was not a new idea to try and get jamming up online.
No. And there's some great services out there now. And I've been toing and froing for over a year and I've just never been able to coordinate it yet. And it's mostly my fault. One of the guys from Res Rocket Surfer, one of the fellow sort of non-owner people, is a guy called Ben Lewis, who we had on the show very early. I think Ben was like episode 3, 4, 5, 6, somewhere around there. And he plays in the Lieutenant Dan band, which is obviously that amazing band that plays for veterans, including, I've had an awful blank, but the guy from Forrest Gump, and obviously not Tom Hanks.
Gary Sinise.
But he goes around with Gary Sinise, of course. Ben Lewis was part of Res Rocket Surfer, and I know he's a big advocate for one of those jamming services existing today called FarPlay. And you are now at the stage where if you're not thousands of kilometers away, but, tens or hundreds of kilometers away, you can essentially manage the latency and jam in real time with other musicians online. It's absolutely incredible.
That's great. That's awesome. It wouldn't work for you and me though, mate. We're 1,000 miles apart, literally.
No, and we should try it. I believe it's amazing, but I haven't actually tried it in depth myself, but I think we would struggle.
Yeah. Very cool. Now let's move forward in time a little bit. And again, this is something I suspect many of our listeners and viewers don't know about you, but you are an original solo artist and you have released a little bit of ambient music, and I've listened to it and it's good. So tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, but you're biased, mate. I pay you big bucks to say that. And just for the record, and this is why I love him so much, Paul doesn't get a damn red cent for doing all he does for this show. So thank you, Paul. But yeah, so Stainless Fields came about. I've always composed the odd little bit and piece over the year. When we get to the desert island discs, it'll become apparent what some of my influences are, but I love ambient music. I have huge respect for some of the newer ambient artists and also the older ones. Everything from, Tangerine Dream Jarre is obviously a big one for me, but right up to harpers like Andreas Vollenweider to, Tim Hecker, Nils Fram, like all that. That's not ambient, but, just instrumental music. You name it, I love it. So, yeah, like a lot of people, I think during COVID, we had a bit of time on our hands. And I finally thought, look, I've got some songs here. I'm going to release the first Stainless Fields album. Stainless Fields actually came from, I'm a rabid fan of the poet Philip Larkin. I was taught him in English when I was at school. Some of our UK listeners will absolutely know who Philip Larkin is, others not so much. So the first album was called Somewhere Becoming Rain, and both the title of the album and every single song is inspired by a Philip Larkin poem, as is the name of the band Stainless Fields, and it's just conglomerating different words from different parts of his poems.
Mm-hmm.
So extremely proud of that album. And even though it didn't get a lot, like all of us, it doesn't get a lot of exposure, but I was super thrilled that they were happy to feature that album as part of the artifacts for the 100th anniversary of Philip Larkin's birth. So Philip Larkin died late 70s, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so the 100th anniversary of his birth, that album was featured as a few things on a YouTube channel as a curated exhibition of Philip Larkin, which was amazing. And then the second and third albums were also based on poets I admired. So the second one was a US poet called Robert Lowell. And again, some US listeners may definitely know Robert Lowell. And then the third album, whose name Son's Disciples in that series was an Australian poet, Gwen Harwood. So I picked a UK, US and Australian poet that I loved and wrote albums and songs around those. And then in between that, I also did a long, it's four pieces on summer, winter, spring, and autumn or fall if you're in the US, about night time in each of those 4 seasons in a rural area in Australia. So it's an ambient thing that if you need help falling asleep, I recommend Rural Nights. And that's its purpose. I mean, there's lots of sleep music out there. You don't need mine necessarily, but if you want to, it's all on YouTube. All 4 of these are on YouTube. They're on all the streaming services. If you look for Stainless Fields, you'll see the millions of subscribers I have on Spotify. I think at last check I had 3.
And David, you will be a good boy and link to this in the show notes, I hope, so people can find your music.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
Yes.
I'm determined to get us to 4 subscribers. Yeah, I'm going to get us to 4 subscribers on Stainless Fields Spotify if I can. Just while we're on that too, again, there's a lot of artists out there that release great music, and I've had the privilege of interviewing some of them, but I know, just being on social media, there are lots of people that release music themselves and get no exposure. It is really hard. Spotify is generally evil. Apple Music pays marginally better. Some of the other services. YouTube's not too bad. So YouTube's actually okay as far as paying us if you get, a few hits. Spotify is just rubbish. I know this podcast goes out on Spotify and we have probably a tenth of our audience comes via Spotify, but, I'm not a fan from an artist's viewpoint, but yeah.
Bold statement, David, but I love it. I love this. I love this courage you're showing here. So tell me, you have a poem in your head. You're inspired to create some music, and you're thinking about some other atmospheres, as you said, maybe a sunset in a beautiful country town. What VSTs or keyboards or things am I taking into the studio to record this stuff? What do I use?
Yeah. Oh, now you're testing me. That's a question I didn't expect. So I did use a lot of it. Look, I have a fairly decent suite of native instruments and Arturia plugins.
Mm.
So I mostly, when I'm doing the ambient stuff, I am using a MIDI controller. I've got literally in front of me here, I've got an Arturia Keylab MIDI controller, and I just tend to use those. I love some of the native instruments, more esoteric stuff. So there's one called Ethereal Earth. There's another one called Bioscape. Mm-hmm. I tend to mix some great pads in with those and go from there. It just, it depends what takes my fancy at the time.
Yeah.
I just haven't done much I mentioned earlier that there was a musical project that I wanted to progress with. So my friend Mike from Midnight Mastering, him and I are in another called Midnight Fields rather than Stainless Fields. And that's, we're doing a lot of ambient, but more edgier stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a privilege doing that with him. And we're currently doing a project, just sort of, not that it's about to blow up, but it's as far as become a world beater by any stretch. But we're just taking on a new look at a classical, something that's already been done in the classical domain as far as the theme. And we're only in very early days with that. And both Mike and I haven't had a lot of time, but we're working through that. Yeah, plugins, I'm a bit boring. It's the Native Instruments and Arturia stuff. I do have an Ovation Summit, but I tend to be too lazy to plug that in and get it hooked up to use it, even though it's an amazing synth. And back in the day, prior to these albums, I did have a Dave Smith Instruments Polyevolver, which I regret to this day selling, because some of the initial demos and that I did, there were some amazing sounds on that keyboard.
Yeah.
If I ever have a spare bit of cash, I'd like to buy one. I just realised I left that off my list of keyboards too.
Well, this is a good segue for me, David, because that was the next thing I wanted to talk to you about. And I mentioned this at the start.
Okay.
That you're a great lover of acquiring keyboards, and look, who doesn't enjoy playing? You know, I flippantly said before I don't suffer from gas, but I do like playing new keyboards and new gear too. I just don't like spending money, right? But can I say, David's owned all sorts of really cool keyboards over the years. So can you tell us about what you've had, what you've owned, and maybe what you have now? And love to know what you use in your current band, and what have been some of your favourite pieces of hardware over the journey.
Yeah, no problem. So I've sort of mentioned a few of them chronologically. So early days was the JVC keyboard, and then the DSR 1000, which had this amazing little lift-up panel. So your panel with all your sounds would actually go up to a 45-degree angle. And I've been surprised more keyboards still haven't done that. But anyway, it's and then I bought a JV 1080 with an A30 MIDI controller, upgraded to the amazing A80. It weighed a ton, but what a keyboard that was. And then when I was in those cover bands as a adult in my 30s, I bought the Yamaha S70XS, which I still argue it's one of my favorite keyboards of all time. Again, weighed a ton.
Why?
I think it would outweigh Kronos. Just at the time, it was so easy to set up MIDI controller activities. It was solid. From memory, it was piano-weighted keys. That was the first keyboard I owned with piano-weighted keys and piano-sized keys. I don't know. Actually, the Yamaha, wasn't a MIDI controller either. It had full on board. It was a workstation, but it also had good MIDI controller functions. It just sounded great. So to give an example, we play some songs in my band today that I still can't replicate particular sounds as well as I was able to on that keyboard in the early 2000s. Wow. I don't know what it was. But the Yamaha S70XS, I know there'd be lots of people out there that may have had that one. So that was a favourite. So you can see I went from Roland to Yamaha, and then I went from Yamaha to Korg. So I had Triton LE there for years in a cover band, which I loved. Again, really great keyboard. I'm assuming, Paul, at one stage you would have played Tritons. I only had the LE, but, you know.
I'm a Korg fan, as you know. But no, I never had a Triton. No. That was, for me,
there you go.
I wanted but couldn't afford.
Yeah. So, and I loved its interface, and it was my first, experience getting my head around combis versus patches and stuff like that. So, used it for years. I was made redundant from a job and had a bit of a payout and decided to reward myself by buying a Kronos. So that was circa 2017. So I bought the Kronos 2 LS, so the light keys. I'm not a big piano-weighted key player. Aside from loving that Yamaha, I just find the type of music I'm playing in, I just don't need it, and I don't have the classical training. It's actually wasted on me. So I'm not super picky on key beds. A super cheap key bed can be annoying, but for me, I'll pretty much play anything. So the Kronos was great, but again, weighed a ton. I did play it in that Count de Ville's Rock Circus, was an amazing keyboard. Can't fault it. Never understood the appeal of the Korg organs in the Kronos. I understand there are things like the Korg SV, like there's some great Korg organs, don't get me wrong. I never liked particularly the organs on the Korg. Don't know why. And I hated the pitch bend wheel. I'm more of a traditional. I want my modulation and pitch bends as separate wheels.
Yep.
Sold the Kronos. Bought a Nord Electro D. Loved that. Stupidly sold it because I was in between bands. Bought a Krumar 7 because I decided I wanted to have some retro-y electric piano. Again, was amazing. A bit in those early days of the Krumar 7, a bit unreliable, but did play it at a few live gigs. It looked amazing, and I know people love them. And there's the Krumar 17 as well as the 7 now.
Didn't yours arrive with
sold that?
a dented body from memory or a dented case.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I got a special deal via the then distributor in the US, and so they shipped it from Italy direct to me. And you're right, those that own a Kronos 7 know that the top part of the case, it's part of the chassis of it, and it had been battered around in transit. It was all smashed in, and huge credit to Kronos. They sent a replacement lid because it was easy to replace it. And I have heard their customer service in that respect is really, really good. So anyway, it was taking up a lot of room. Again, different bands sold it. Then I entered Yamaha territory. So I'd done Roland and Korg, and then I had the Yamaha S70 previously, but had bought the Modi X7, loved it, and then went to the 7 Plus, and then just in the last couple of months bought the Modi X M7, which I love even more. They're my go-to keyboards for the band. I'll talk about the rig in a sec, but I just love them to bits.
Yeah, but so before
the
Arturic. Before you go on, because I know how much you love the MODX, and clearly because you bought 3 of them, right? So help our listeners and viewers understand specifically why, and again, we're going to talk about your band rig in a sec, but what is it about the MODX that really gets you going?
Yeah, it's the sounds. Now, they're not better than the Korg or Roland, and I realise I've left off. I did own a Roland Phantom 07 around the time I bought the Modi X7, and the Roland sounds are incredible too. Don't get me wrong, but I just love the sweeter sounds. They're perfect for the 80s cover band I was in, and I know some people don't like the Yamaha interface. For those unaware, the Modi X is just the little brother of the Montage series, and the interface is essentially the same. I actually really, really like the interface. I can find my way around it. I can do a lot of things on the fly. I just love it. But it's really the sounds, accentuated by yours and my good friend Francis at NARF Sounds. I mean, it's a well-supported keyboard. So as an 80s cover band player, Francis sound packs are amazing. They totally fit what I need for a lot of the songs we play. And it's just, it's not sturdy. They are plasticky feeling keyboards as far as they're not metal chassis keyboards, but they're also bloody light. So I think the Modi X7, the current one's the lightest ever. I think it's like 11.5 kilos or something like that. It's really quite, it might even be under that. So I just love the lightness. I am so sick of in my 50s lugging around 35 kilo keyboards in big heavy cases. I just can't do it anymore. It drives me balmy. So that's mainly why I love it. Yeah. Arturic Key Labs I've had as a second board for a while, but I recently bought a Viscount Legend one. As you know, we did a great episode with Mitch Town reviewing the Viscount Legend one. That has changed my life as far as I would love to do more organ lessons. But as far as a Hammond, just a tone, not necessarily a Hammond, but a tone wheel clone of all those classic organs, and obviously the Hammond B3 is a core one, it's light, it's meaty, and every single gig I play with that thing where I'm playing organ, I go, okay, this is what a B3 should sound like when it's not actually a B3 itself. You can't beat the real thing. But so that's sort of, but yeah, I had a Polyevolver, Dave Smith Polyevolver, I had the Phantom 07. So for those wondering, well, God, how many keyboards you've got? I've actually only got about 5 keyboards. What I always do is if I buy a new one, I sell an old one. And funnily enough, for those aware, particularly over COVID, the secondhand prices went through the roof. So I was actually able to sell keyboards at a profit to what, only minor, but maybe a couple of $100 more than what I had originally paid for them. At least in the Australian context, it was a great time to be selling secondhand keyboards. So I've had good luck.
Yeah, this
there. And in Australia, as you know, Paul,
it does not go out to the Australian Taxation Office, though. By the way, so we won't mention that.
Well, see, I'm happy to even say that because, funnily enough, I've sold mostly to professional musicians who actually do demand a receipt. So I've actually had to declare all these.
Oh my goodness,
which is sad. Yeah, it's very sad. But that it is what it is. So, and then, the Viscount Legend one. And I also bought that Telepathic Instruments Orchid, which is this little dinky retro unit. Actually, if you look behind me, there's a box. You can see there, that box contains the Orchid. Actually, in
Nice.
that little keyboard, there's another Novation little MIDI controller. There, I keep forgetting where I've got keyboards. And to my right is the I've got the Novation Summit. I have kept one of my other Modi X's, and that's pretty much it. I did own a DX7 there for a while. About 5 years ago, I just bought one second hand, had a play around with it, and then sold it again. So yeah, I've had a few.
Yeah.
Last name drop in regards to keyboards is Lockie Doley was selling his Nord Stage 4, and I did actually buy that off him and realised it wasn't for me and on-sold it, I think, about 2 months later. Didn't make a cent on that one. I literally sold it for what I paid for it, but it was nice catching up with Lockie again when I went to pick it up. So
Yeah, nice work. Nice work. So tell us, out of all these wonderful bits and pieces that you've had and owned and some that you still own, what do you take out with your current band with Gloss?
Yeah, so with Gloss, it's the Modi X now M7, and then I have the Viscount Legend one on top. I have them both connected to my laptop via MainStage. I accentuate the Legend one for the odd song with a couple of plugins if I choose to use the Legend one, but the vast majority of the night I'm using the Modi X M7 anyway. But there are about 6 or 8 songs where we use organ, and the Modi X is known for having weak organs. The M7's had an improvement. They've improved the tone wheel module and stuff, but they've got marginally better. But you've only got to play something like the Legend one. You go, they're still a country mile off that. So so the Viscount is pretty much my organ playing top one. So I tend to sit and stand throughout the night, depending on what I'm playing, and that's my rig. And then, so I have it hooked up to the laptop. MainStage is basically used as a MIDI controller. So I basically just, and it's also as a fake book. So I do have my chords and that written down in the, I've set up a text space in MainStage for each patch. So I can to remind me what key it's in. If there's I just have that safety net there that if I do need to, or it's a new song and I'm forgetting which way it goes, I can quickly glance and go, oh, that's right. That's the chord structure. And then I have all that hooked up to a Radial Engineering KL8. So it's a line mixer. I know lots of our listeners know the Key Largo. The Key Largo is amazing. I just tended to take the step up because of the laptop and the 2 keyboards, and also wanting to use wired in-ears connected to the interface. I use the KL8 for all that. It's not cheap. I think in Australian dollars it was about $1,400, but it's the best money I've ever spent. I just love that interface a bit. It means that I can mix in front of house feed that goes in the back of the KL8 with my own keyboards via its own volume knob, and then just everything's there. It also has, most importantly, for those that like to stuff around between songs, it has a cue button, so I can press a cue button on any of the channels and play the keyboard in my in-ears without anything going out front of house. If I'm worried that something's not working or I want to test a sound or whatever, and then as long as you remember to unpress the cue button, because I've done that before where I've been stuffing around before a show and then we've started the show and nothing because I've forgotten to turn off the cue button. But I've done that once or twice. So that's basically the rig. It's the laptop, the KL8. I do have a power conditioner too, so I have a small rack mount unit that literally has the KL8 as one rack mount, a power conditioner, and then there is a YouTube video I've got of my rig pre-Viscount Legend 1, so I had an Arturia key step as the top one prior to that, if people are particularly interested. But the KL8, and I know you've got the Key Largo, Paul, I mean, Radial Engineering stuff, people I know rave about it all the time, but for good reason. It's just such high quality gear. And we're not sponsored by them. We're not sponsored by anyone.
No, and this is a good time to say that all the keyboards and gear that we've been talking about, it's just our opinion. It's just David's opinion. We are not influenced by any sponsors because none of these companies sponsor us. Although, that being said, if you're from Korg or Yamaha and you're interested in reaching out and sponsoring us, please reach out and have a chat to us. So certainly right. we're only influenced by our own opinions, nothing else. So it's completely unfiltered, which is a great thing. And yes, I have got the Radial Key Largo because I've got David's old Radial Key Largo, which he kindly sold to me. And yeah, one of the best purchases I ever made because it's a wonderful bit of gear. I haven't got the KL8, but I have another big line mixer that I use. But if that ever dies, I'm definitely going to get the KL8 based purely on your recommendation because I know how happy you've been with yours. But yeah, I love my Key Largo. And I won't hear any bad things said about it.
I highly recommend it.
Yeah, exactly.
No, they are amazing.
So, David, we've established your credibility as a wonderful keyboard player and solo artist. and technology expert and owner of lots of gear. But I think a lot of our listeners and viewers will be fascinated to learn a bit more about the podcast and behind the scenes. So I'm going to start with a really obvious question, which is, what made you start the podcast in the first place, David?
Yeah, no, thank you. So I got the podcast bug many years ago. I used to run a podcast to do with the virtual world, so Second Life, and talking about that. And then I ended up doing about 146, I think it was, episodes of a gaming podcast called Flashpoint. That then merged into another podcast with a guy called We Hate People, where we talk more broadly about gaming, politics, and a whole bunch of stuff. But yeah, come 2019, it was actually pre-COVID, so it was November 2019. I'd had a long-standing interest. I thought, gee, there's not a lot of podcasts out there for keyboard players. There is obviously some great tech-based podcasts that keyboard players are attracted to. The amazing guys at Sonic State. I mean, there's a lot of them. YouTube channels, there are literally, dozens of great creators, from Woody's Piano Shack through to Loop Hop to you name it. There's some great people there. But there was, at that stage, and I still don't think it exists today, there's still no one devoted to the stories of the players themselves and their lives in music. So that was the intent from the get-go, is we're not going to be super about tech. We love tech, as you know, Paul, and we'll talk about it till the cows come home. But it's more about the player and their life and what they've learnt from being a player throughout their career. So I just jumped in. Episode 1, I approached, I'm hugely apologetic, I've forgotten his name, but from the band that you see in episode 1, whose name I also forget. I was just admiring his music on YouTube. They're a British band that still tour around. They're a great indie band. I feel terrible forgetting the name. And so he agreed very kindly to be the first episode. I think I had your good self on episode, were you episode 2?
No, I think I
was.
Or
it Dave Bryce? Oh, yeah, it might have been Dave.
4 or 5 or something like that. I might have been on. Clearly, you were battling to get good guests, so you reached out to me. But it was a pleasure to be on the podcast. I must say, I really enjoyed it.
So yeah, that was the intent, to just get players on and talk about. And it was great having you on. I basically reached out to people I knew for those initial episodes, because obviously no one is going to come on unless they happen to feel like they're doing a favour to the guy doing it. And then it really changed with episode 6, where we had Andrew Farris from NXS on. So he was promoting, I think, from memory, a new album, and was happy to come on and talk about his role as keyboard player in NXS and his career more broadly. Once we had Andrew Farris's episode, it was much easier then to approach known artists, and it's taken off from there. So it's that was the initial impetus for starting it up.
Yeah, well, it's certainly gone from strength to strength, and a personal message from me. It's been a pleasure to be invited to be involved. So thank you for that opportunity, David. It's been wonderful. But I'd love you to reflect on maybe your top dozen or so guests that you've had on the show over time. And look, we've loved all our guests. We know this.
Yeah.
But who would be your absolute, for whatever reason, your absolute favourite episodes that you've done, David?
Yeah, as you said, it is so hard. I think we've talked about at one of our other interview shows, we literally have not had an unpleasant guest. So there's not been a single person that we've gotten off the call and gone, wow, I'm glad that's over. The biggest criticism I could throw at anyone was some guests are very polished and have done lots of media, and you can tell that part of it is going through the motions. But if that's the worst criticism you can throw at someone, it shows that it's pretty good outcome. So it's nearly impossible. And even when I was coming up with these sort of 12 names, I thought of another 12 that I even somewhat keep in touch. I do want to reassure future guests, it's not as if I get you on the show, I'm going to demand to be friends for life. It's not that at all. But some guests are very happy to, keep in broad touch, which is lovely. So we appreciate that. But yeah, I remember an early guest in the first 10 episodes who was a relatively well-known guest who was worried that because they'd given me their mobile phone number, that I was going to start texting them every day. And it's like, no, that's not how I operate. I understand I'm doing an interview and that the relationship somewhat ends after that interview. I'm not delusional. So, yeah, that was it. So top 12, in no particular order, Jim Magini from Midnight Oil. Midnight Oil are known worldwide. Jim is just an amazingly creative guy. It took a lot of work to get him on the podcast, not because he was reluctant as such, but he didn't feel he was just a keyboard player that was worthy of appearing on the podcast, which is farcical to the extreme given his talent. So Jim Magini last year, or was it early this year? I've lost track now. I think it was early this year, was a major highlight. Just such an iconic guy. Going over to the UK, Mikey Rowe. So Mikey Rowe was with Oasis in the latter part of their career and then has been Noel Gallagher's keyboard player with the High Flying Birds. Just a genuinely lovely guy. Great anecdotes. Highly recommend listening to his show. Really good. Really disappointed to see he wasn't picked up to do the Oasis tour, this world-beating tour they've been doing over the past 9 months. But yeah, Mikey was amazing. It's hard, Paul, I'm sure you're aware of the recency effect. I tend to remember the more recent interviews the most, and they tend to place a higher ranking depending on when I'm asked. But I think legitimately it doesn't matter how many years I get away from this one, Roger O'Donnell from The Cure was an absolute highlight. Just such a lovely guy with some really deep insights into creativity. Just stunning, just an amazing guy. And I do recommend, again, checking out his latest solo album, Projections. It's superb. I actually took delivery. I bought the vinyl version of it, and it was just delivered the other day, and I'm excited to listen to it on vinyl. So Roger O'Donnell would probably be my equal number one pick across the 12, taking into account the recency effect. The other equal number one, which is from about 18 months, 2 years ago, and I know I've talked about him repeatedly, is Jim Prime. So Jim Prime was the keyboard player in Deacon Blue, and Jim sadly passed away this year. Now, Jim was an absolute highlight to talk to anyway, and he was the only guest up until recently that I'd done a rig tour whilst he was touring prior to doing the full interview. He was a bit reluctant to speak to me backstage and essentially said, if I hadn't have seen Bill Payne from Little Feat have been on your show, I wouldn't have talked to you. But then loosened up after that and had that true Scottish sense of humour and was amazing for the rig tour and even more amazing for his full interview. I can't recommend it highly enough. But what adds extra specialness to that is after Jim passed, and he passed relatively suddenly, I'm thinking that'd be 5 months ago now, his family reached out. And this is public in the YouTube comments. A couple of members of his family actually watched the video because they were, finding out information about their dad's working life and obviously reminiscing about that. And they expressed huge appreciation for the fact that there was an interview with Jim. So that's what makes this podcast all worthwhile is that, I hope none of our other guests pass away, but in the event that it does happen, they were super appreciative that there was a record of Jim's work. So yeah, that would be my equal number one. I've mentioned it repeatedly, but his Little Richard anecdote is worth the price of admission for that interview alone. I cannot recommend it highly enough if it's just beyond funny. Brittany Davis, which Paul, I'm pretty sure you weren't there for that one. Brittany is this amazing artist from the US. Brittany is sight impaired, releases this amazing music. She had an album released this year, which was stunning. I only interviewed her a few months ago. The vibe she gives off talking to her, even though she's not super well known, but she does tour around Europe a little bit and is getting a name in the US. I just feel like talking to her was a bit like what it would have been like talking to Stevie Wonder or Ray Charles, and I'm not just using the sight impairment as the comparator here, just iconic artists that have their own presence, and Britney certainly has that. So that's another highlight. From one extreme to the other, Andy Bown, there's the keyboard player with Status Quo. It took quite a lot of effort for Andy and I technologically to get in the same room and record the interview through no one's fault. Andy was utterly amazing. And as we talked about in the interview, he literally played the first notes of Live Aid, but just an amazing raconteur, just had some great anecdotes and just a genuinely funny guy. So he was a highlight. Bobby Ogden, Elvis's last keyboard player, that was a huge highlight, and an enormous thanks to Steve Nathan, who's put me in touch with a range of artists that we've interviewed, and Bobby definitely one of those, because Steve had recently done a session with Bobby and Brandon Flowers on Brandon Flowers' new soul album. So Bobby was an absolute treasure to speak with. And Kerry Mania from Gentle Giant. Sorry, I had a mental blank there for a minute. Kerry, again, amazing, lovely guy. Mike McKnight, who is still working hard to this day. He's been the go-to keyboard player and tracks and backstage tech from a keyboard viewpoint, from everyone from Madonna to Roger Waters to Mariah Carey. He was just recently Australian with Mariah Carey, and unfortunately we were due to catch up, but I was ill. Just an amazing guy, and just again, some of his anecdotes were stunning, so highly recommend that. Larry Mullins from Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds and Swan, just again, generally brilliant guy, lots of interesting insights. Last two, we're getting there, Paul. Anna Lapwood. Anna Lapwood is our most viewed episode and our most listened to episode, and for good reason. Anna has got, it'd be now 18 months to 2 years since we interviewed Anna, and she was still teaching at Cambridge whilst having this amazing solo career, playing on some of the world's largest organs internationally. She's since gone full-time professional as a solo artist and is going from strength to strength, and I'm just so thrilled. She's actually coming out to Australia next year. I've already bought tickets. I doubt I'll get the chance to catch up with her, but Anna Lapwood, if you want an inspirational story and passion for keyboard playing or organ playing, particularly when she nearly threw it all in. So there's an amazing part of her story where she decided, this is not for me. I'm not good at this. I'm throwing it in. And to see where she is today is amazing. And last but not least, Ray Thistlethwaite. So Ray's an Aussie artist, but a lot of our US listeners will know him from Noah. He also spent a lot of time touring the US, I think parts of Europe, with Sammy Hagar, Steve Vai as the keyboard player, and the amazing drummer. I've used amazing about 95 times in this. The incredible drummer that was with Mellencamp. I always forget his name, bald guy.
Kenny Aronoff.
Go-to session drummer. Kenny Aronoff. He's spent the last 2 years. He's also sort of front man for an iconic Australian band, Thirsty Merc. He does solo work. Ray's interview was just a pleasure. We only had a very short 50 minutes or so with Ray. We're hoping to reconvene with him in the future, but he's just the most amazing player, guy, has huge imposter syndrome at different times, doesn't have an answer for what to do about that, but was just amazing. That's my 12, but I do very, very quickly, just honourable man. I mean, I said I've missed a whole bunch, like Mike Garson, which I know you were present for, like David Bowie's keyboard player, Jenny Connolly, Drysos from the Decemberists, Dave Weiser I mentioned earlier, Rich Hilton from Nile Rodgers, Troy Kinnett from John Mellencamp's band. Like, there's so many amazing people. And I'm even going to do a quick shout out to Andy Holzman, who we did a tour for just last weekend, who worked with Miles Davis and was Miles Davis's musical director for a number of years and now plays with Stephen Wilson. I met Adam last weekend. Incredible guy. And we've got an interview hopefully coming up with him in the next couple of weeks. Just so many. And I mean, Paul, I know it's meant to be about me, but rattle off 5 artists or a few artists that were highlights for you that I haven't even mentioned.
I'm the interviewer, mate. V asks the questions, not you. Look, off the top of my head, it would be Andrew Farris for all the reasons you mentioned. Yeah. Plus, I was a massive INXS fan in high school.
Yeah.
I loved the interview with Jordan Rudess, where I was sitting out in country Australia outdoors. Yes. Jordan was everything I hoped he'd be. He was just a really nice, humble guy and a bit of a musical genius type mindset, which it was really good fun. Yeah, I loved. You shouldn't have done this to me. There's probably 3 or 4 more that.
That's all right.
Hard, right? 170 episodes, David, and some of the ones I've loved the most have not been ones I've been involved in, to be honest. You've done some wonderful work there, but, I love it when we interview guests and they, you talked about Ray Thistlethwaite having imposter syndrome. Well, if it's good enough for Ray Thistlethwaite to have imposter syndrome, it's good enough for all of us to have it, because how you could have that level of talent and have imposter syndrome, I do not know. But this is the point. We're all fragile humans, and when they're vulnerable and they're honest about what they've struggled with, and they share their train wreck moments, and it's like, it just makes us all feel a bit more human and connect with these people. And I love that about the podcast. And listeners and viewers, I bet you heard David's passion as he was reeling off those guests. He nearly mentioned all 170 interviews that he's done in that list. And that leads me to my next question, David, which is, can you take us through the process? What happens end to end for one show? What does that look like for you as the person who puts this together?
Yeah. No, thank you. It's a highly variable process, but broadly, I will see stuff on YouTube or an artist. I do have what I call my master spreadsheet. So I do have a spreadsheet that has a couple of hundred people on it, obviously a lot of which have a green line through them of having been interviewed. But there are people that I've literally spent 2 or 3 years attempting to get and am still attempting to get without harassing people. So there's a real art to, and I don't always get it right, of reaching out, no response, trying again 6 to 12 months later. And the avenues of reaching out are also fraught. So for some artists, it is basically impossible to find a way to reach out. So I'll give you an example. I've mentioned many times, I would kill to talk to Roy Bitton from the E Street Band. I'm aware of who his PR company are, and I haven't asked the question as yet, but I've made multiple previous attempts just via very generic email addresses. You can imagine the quantity of requests they get. That may never happen, through to major artists like actually one that I failed to mention that we were both on, Paul, was Steve Porcaro from Toto. I think it was episode 30.
Yeah.
I literally messaged him on Facebook via his page and he responded within 30 minutes. So it's highly variable. I basically approach ideally via the artist's website if they've got one. And so quite often that'll be a contact form, and I just hope for the best. It'll be via Instagram, but Instagram can't really message someone unless they're following you, so that tends to not be super successful. Facebook is a little bit the same, and then I'll just it tends to be via websites or agents or managers. So the really big artists obviously have really clear direction on here's who you go to for interview requests or PR requests. And then the other avenue is I've obviously fostered relationships with a whole range of PR people from either indie record labels or even other areas who I just get regular emails every week saying this artist is releasing this album, these availabilities are there for interviews, and so on. So I do pick up. So Kerry Monier, for example, from Gentle Giant, was because Gentle Giant were releasing a retrospective. One of their amazing albums had been remastered, and that gave me the opportunity to say, yes, I would love to interview Kerry, and that's why that was organised. So a lot of it tends to be aligned with promotional cycles, but a lot of it's not. I won't say who, but I made an approach to someone last night that I would kill to have on the show. That was my first reach out. There's someone, Paul, you and I talked about before the show that I've tried 2 or 3 times, and thankfully they've changed PR companies and they're actually responding and actually keen to have that person come on the show. Ray's an example of someone, we've just been talking about Ray Thistlethwaite. His original PR person was an outright no. I followed up a year later. She did kindly pass it on to the new PR people, and they came back, or I think it was Ray himself actually. Ray himself came back within, half an hour saying, yeah, let's do this. So it's highly variable. But anyway, that's the guest seeking process. So I do have a spreadsheet. We have guests suggest potential. So we have listeners suggest potential guests. I take them very seriously. We've got a massive backlog of people that we would love to interview. And I do also get the odd artist pitch. So I've had just one in the last few days. I've had someone saying, I would be great for your show. That's always really difficult. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. That's always a bit interesting to manage. But anyway, let's assume we've got guests. So then once the guest agrees to come on, there's a lot of toing and froing to provide them. We try and make it as efficient as possible. Sometimes it's via their PR person or sometimes it's direct. We provide the link to join the show. We give some advice around what we're potentially going to ask. So we absolutely don't give the run sheet, but we say there are some common questions like the Desert Island Disc question and a train wreck question, and that we're interested in talking about their whole career. Some PR people will need some massaging around, yes, we will make sure that we cover off the latest album that you're promoting up front. We would always talk about it anyway, but, if it makes a difference between getting them on board or whatever, we're happy to change the sequence a little bit. And then most times they log in successfully. There are some times, it can take 2 or 3 goes due to lack of technical capability. Very sadly, for the first time across 170 episodes recently, we had someone where the sound was perfect while recording. we recorded a 45-minute interview. Riverside, the platform we use, records locally, which is the beauty of it. So we get high-quality audio. For some reason, the local recording on that person's computer was totally unusable. It was absolutely unusable, and it came through our end as unusable, and we've wasted the whole 45 minutes. And so basically we're still trying to work with that person to get them to come on and essentially do another interview all over again. That's the first time that's happened, thankfully. So that's the end. We obviously record, and then the editing process. At the moment, we've got so many guests. There's basically an 8-week lag from when we record. We do have some lag time because of the number of guests. So, this one was recorded on a Saturday, late November, and it probably won't come out much before Christmas, and that'll be rushed out compared to some. So we do have a 6 to 8 week lag. The editing process is tedious. AI helps a little bit, so we can now automatically pull out some of the ums and ahs and the long pauses. But for every hour of interview time, it's usually taking me 2 to 3 hours of edit time at least. And I put lots of focus into trying to keep the audio nice. We're still not perfect on the audio. It depends on the guest, but we get there. And then obviously once we release the episode, we follow up with the guest, thank them very much for their time because we do hugely appreciate it. Send them a link to the show, and then the guest can choose to promote it on their socials if they like. It goes without saying the guests that promote their own stuff on their socials tend to get the more views than the ones that are just sinks like a stone. They're quite happy to do the interview, but either don't have the capability or just don't like promoting themselves, which I understand doing this show right now. It tends to affect how many people get to see it, but that's life. I think that's the end to end, Paul. I think I'll leave it there.
Yeah, nice. So tell us about the process around the rig tours. So you've put a few rig tours. How do you organise those? How does that work? How do you get the guests to agree to let you come up on stage and take you through the keyboards?
Yeah. So that's another whole logistical nightmare. So it depends. So quite often we'll reach out to a guest that we've already had on the show when I hear they're touring. So that is the easy one. And if we've had a great interview and, there's some rapport there, I will then say, hey, such and such, I see you coming out next year. I've just done this week with an artist. I see you coming out. Would absolutely love to follow up and do a re-tour if you're up for it. Now, at the end of every interview, and our guests and listeners don't see this, but when we stop recording, we also reinforce that when we're doing our actual interviews, we say we would love to follow up with you down the track, particularly if you're in Australia, because obviously your story's not finished, and we do love doing follow-up episodes. So we do reach out. We go, I hear you're touring Australia. If it's direct to the artist, that tends to be easy. If it's via PR, it's nearly impossible. There are exceptions, but usually you have to be in direct contact with the artist to have them, because it's actually quite an onus on them. So to give an example, the rig tour with Andy Holzman last week, Andy was amazing because we haven't done our interview yet, but he's obviously aware of the show, and it required a lot of him on an incredibly busy tour. He'd flown in from Melbourne that day. He only had a few hours in Sydney for sound check. He had to, I'm assuming he would have had to get approval from the tour manager. Him and I toed and froed via, in this case, WhatsApp. I let him know when I was at the loading dock at the venue. So I'm getting to know most of the Sydney venues and how to access them from a security viewpoint, to get clearance to go in. Andy had to come from backstage up, a bunch of corridors and lifts to meet me. He has to take me down. Prior to me going down, he'd already organised for the sound to be coming out the front of PA and the lights to remain up. It does ask a lot of a guest to do, and Andy was one of the utterly amazing people. Dennis Atlas for Toto was exactly the same. He put a lot of effort to make sure it worked. And then they're usually quite disappointed to see I don't have a full film, like a film crew setup. Most guests are usually taken aback. So it's just the phone, and it's like, well, that's all I've got at this stage. And with the new iPhones and the cameras and the lighting and post edit, the quality is relatively good. I would love to be able to do the fuller thing, but that's just not feasible at this stage. And generally, I've never had any pushback on the rig tours. They all love to see them because, as you know, out there in keyboard land, most of us don't get any spotlight for our live work. We tend to disappear off the photos or the videos. Yeah. So to actually have a rig tour, the artists generally really, really like it. And for us keyboard players, it's fascinating, as you know, seeing what everyone else is playing. And the Dennis Atlas one is our second most viewed video of all time because Dennis goes into amazing detail on how he replicates some of those key Toto sounds. It's absolutely fascinating. And so the other behind the scenes is I'm sitting there with a grin on my face going, I can't believe I'm standing here. I mean, with Dennis Atlas, I know we're coming up to 90 minutes, which I'm horrified by. But with Dennis Atlas, I remember standing there filming him, and out of the corner of my eyes is Greg Fillingain still sitting behind him. They just finished sound check, and he's doing some stuff on his keyboard. And I'm going, I can't believe I'm standing here filming what Dennis is saying. Greg Fillingain is literally 4 meters away, and I had to watch him walk off because there'd been no arrangement to speak with Greg, and nor would I approach him cold. And I can't believe I'm here. And I know, Paul, you've done a rig tour as well with Chris Norton in Adelaide, and it's quite a surreal experience.
It's great fun. Yeah, it's absolutely great fun. And speaking of fun, that's my I guess my final question for you on the podcast, David. It's a lot of work, and I hope our listeners and viewers are understanding that. But we love listening to the episodes. I love listening to them, particularly the ones I'm not on. I prefer that. Is it actually fun for you?
Yeah, no, it absolutely is. I love it. I mean, the editing gets a bit tedious, but generally it's fun. I'm yet to have an interview where I said there's the odd unfun bit, but thankfully I've never had huge pushback from guests. There was one guest, and this was actually legitimate, that had been associated with an artist that we talked about briefly in the podcast, but in the promotional material, I'd aligned them with that artist and they didn't necessarily get on with that artist anymore, and also had some significant political differences with that artist. And so they requested I alter the promotional materials. That's about as unpleasant as it got, and they did it incredibly respectfully, and there was no issue. So generally, it's great fun. Yeah, look, I really can't. It's a ball, and I know it's always a ball having you on there as well. I prefer to have a co-host because it's in some ways easier. It's not easier in the edit, but it's easier than running the whole show myself because someone's sitting back when the other person's asking questions, thinking of other questions to ask. So it is quite challenging when you run solo, but and that's why, and a big shout out to we've had some guest co-hosts, so Steve Nathan and Joe Mascara as two particularly notable ones, and then Paul obviously for a whole bunch of the episodes as well. It's so much fun doing that. So yes, it's fun.
That's good. That's good. And I'll take that as a comment on my sustained absence this year.
No, not at all. No. You're a busy touring man. That's the way it should be. That's a good thing.
So David, on that note, it's been an absolute pleasure having you as the guest and being able to turn the tables on you for a process I know you were not that enthusiastic to be doing, and but I think I certainly have got a lot of insight, and I think I know you really well, and I've learned a few things about yourself, your career, and your approach to the podcast. And I think for all our listeners and viewers, it's lovely to learn a bit more about you. But we cannot let you go without asking you the question all our guests hate, although I know you've prepared for this, and that is, what are your 5 desert island discs? So I suspect you might be about to break the rules on me, David.
Yes. Yeah, so as our regular listeners and viewers will know, quite often our guests exceed the 5, and for some reason 6 tends to be the most common one. And just as an aside, our website does actually have all the desert island disc selections from each guest as a great big list. It's due for an update for the last 4 or 5 episodes, but essentially it's all there. So I have actually done 6. I'm going to keep these short and sharp. I know some guests spend 5 minutes explaining each one, but we don't have that time. The first one is a bit of an 80s classic for me as far as just the degree of synthesizer usage, and it blew my mind at the time, was Phil Oakey and Giorgio Moroder's self-titled album. So it was just called Philip Oakey and Giorgio Moroder. And now it does feature that very cheesy song Together in Electric Dreams, which I'll admit I loved, but it contains so much more than that.
Of all time. I love that song.
It's a great song.
Yes, I won't hear you saying bad things about it. I love that song.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. So, and that album is just gold. And they actually, it was quite rare back then in some respects because this is on cassette. They ran the songs into each other. So it was an endless, there were, I think, 4 or 5 songs each side. And on each side, there was no break between the songs. So they segued each of the songs into each other, which technologically would have been hard to do back in the time as well. So that, yeah, very much a big album that I still love playing today. I'm going to give 2 Aussie ones. And I do recommend any non-Australians if you just want extremely high-quality songwriting. First one is an album called Under the Sun by Paul Kelly. US listeners may actually know Paul Kelly. Paul Kelly's got a bit of notoriety in the US for all the right reasons. Not so much sure in Europe, but Paul Kelly in Australian context, as Paul will attest, is an absolute god. He's one of the absolute icons. Well, he's sort of, I know he's been called Australia's Dylan before. He is at that level, Paul Kelly. So yeah, Under the Sun, this is the classic era, mid to late 80s, some of his biggest sings like To Adore, but there are a whole bunch of other songs on that I love much more than To Adore. Just an amazing album. Third one is a Western Australian act called the Triffids. Sadly, their frontman, David McComb, died many, many years ago, but Born Sandy Devotional is an album by the Triffids. Again, it's known for its song Wide Open Road, which again is an iconic song, but again, that whole album just blew my mind, and it would actually probably, if I had to choose my number one of all time, would be my number one album of all time. And then the last three, Songs of Distant Earth by Mike Oldfield. So this goes back to my ambient and instrumental stuff. I'm a major Mike Oldfield fan, but if I had to choose one album, it'd be Songs of Distant Earth, and it's based on the Arthur C. Clarke book, I think it's Arthur C. Clarke or Asimov. I apologise if I got that wrong. It's one of those anyway. And then regular listeners will know I'm a Springsteen tragic, so Darkness on the Edge of Town if I had to choose one Springsteen album. And my sixth, rule-breaking choice, most people know it, is Jean-Michel Jarre's Oxygen. It blew my mind as a 12, 13-year-old and still holds up really well today. Even Oxygen 2 and 3 sort of a nice companions to it, but nothing beats the original. That'll do me for Desert Island Discs, Paul.
David, thank you so much for sharing those discs. As he has said, they'll be up on the show notes. And can I say, it's been a real pleasure being able to interview you and make you squirm in your seat. I know you haven't really enjoyed the process, but I've enjoyed it immensely, and I reckon our listeners and viewers will have too. Thank you so much for allowing me to be a very, very, very small part of your podcast, mate.
No, look, I couldn't do it without you, and you made what was a squirmy process much more bearable than otherwise it would have been. So no, thanks, mate. And we'll talk soon.
So there we have it. What an amazing guest. That was David Holloway. I hope you enjoyed learning out a little bit more about him. David and I are wearing shirts donated to us by Tammy Catcher of Tammy's Musical Stew, and a valued sponsor. And I've got Daniel Martin and the infamous, and David has Chrome. Now, I was drawn to this because the first band I was ever in, the lead guitarist was a bloke named Daniel Martin. Unbelievable, but it's not this Daniel Martin.
Wow.
These guys are a goth metal, intense type band, and I'll tell you what, I like that music, and you should check these guys out too if you like that music. Chrome have got the Chromosome showroom in Edmonton, and what a wonderful venue that is. It supports all sorts of artists coming in. Technical excellence is what you expect from Chrome when you deal with them. If you would like us to promote your band on the show, send us a shirt and we're going to do it. Thanks, Tammy. A shout out to our gold and silver supporters. Tammy, we mentioned from Tammy Catcher's Musical Stew. We love you, Tammy. Thanks for all your support. Dewi Evans from the sunny land of Wales with long unpronounceable names of towns. Dewi, thank you. And Mike from Midnight Mastering, who I'm working with right now. So can I tell you, I can't recommend the man enough in terms of his professionalism. Our website is keyboardchronicles.com. You can also reach us on Facebook, on Twitter.com, the keyboard CHR1. And you can also drop David, not me, because I won't respond, a line at editor@keyboardchronicles.com as well too. Now, if you want to keep David off the streets and doing this podcast for another 170 episodes, what you need to do is become a patron. And you can do that through patreon.com/Keyboard Chronicles. For a cup of coffee, you can keep this amazing show going. Less of me, more of David. That's what we need. Thanks, everyone, for your time. Thank you, David, for being my guest. I'm not letting him talk. That's
My
it.
pleasure.
See you later.
Bye.